You're listening to Big World Network.
Just Kill Me, Season 3, Episode 3, The KGB Babysits, written and read by Wendy Herman. I hadn't seen him in 25 years, since he'd walked out on us. I was 15 and my little brother Locke was just 5 years old. My mother didn't seem devastated, but more relieved when he left. That spoke volumes to me, although I was just a teenager. We didn't talk about him after that, and we both did the best we could to raise Locke to not be like his dad. The general attitude was that we were better off without him. End of story. My mother was an engineer working as a civilian employee for the Air Force, and 3 years later, right after I had left for college, she was transferred to Germany, where she met and fell in love with a local widower named Klaus Spang. They were married the next year, and she and Locke moved into the lovely apartment above his bakery in a tiny village called Niersbach, in the southwestern part of the country. Klaus was a good man and adored my mother, and soon after the wedding he officially adopted Locke as his own. Locke, who was now almost 30 years old, had spent years traveling and exploring Europe after school, learning several trades and having a blast, courtesy of his adopted father. But he finally decided on becoming a chef. He was currently in one of the best culinary schools in the world, located in Cologne. Needless to say, I rarely saw them, but I made a point to call at least once a month. I missed them terribly. I had already talked to my mother twice that month, but the happenings of the day warranted a third. I lied to her and told her I had received a letter from the IRS wanting to know my father's whereabouts, and that I wanted to flick this booger as quickly as possible. She just sighed, as if it didn't surprise her one bit that he would be in trouble with the government, and reluctantly gave me the last address she remembered. I knew the little town. It was a 2-hour drive, but there was no sense in waiting. Ty and I were planning to leave the minute he came back from dropping Trevor off at FBI headquarters, assuming that all went to plan. Right. After talking casually about our lives for a few more minutes, she mentioned that Locke had met a young Belgian woman, and he was head over heels. I would have to interrogate him about that the next time we spoke. We each said "I love you" and hung up. I took a deep breath and stared at the address on the yellow sticky note in my hand. I hadn't heard Levi come up behind me. "Whose address is that?" I jumped and my heart skipped a beat. He really needed to consider becoming a ninja. I put my hand on my chest and turned to him, smiling. When I caught my breath, I responded, "It's my father's, your grandfather's address." I was so tired of all the lies and saw no reason to add to the long, long list of them. He came to my side and we both regarded the sticky note for a moment. "Are you going to see him?" "Yes. Uncle Rip and I are going tonight." "Is Talia coming over then?" I nodded. Talia had only suffered a minor concussion, amazingly, and had been released after just a few hours. I had followed the ambulance to the hospital after Levi convinced me he was perfectly capable of babysitting for an hour or so, and after the doctor told her she didn't have to stay the night, she insisted she was up to playing nanny for a few days. Lars, who I'd called at Talia's insistence, and who'd been at her bedside within 15 minutes of said phone call, had agreed to come over and help. It seems the two were getting pretty serious, and I found out he used to be a school teacher in Sweden, so I allowed it. Lars had seemed very concerned and attentive, readjusting her pillow every 5 minutes and making her take sips of water. He was a good man, I could tell, like Ty. Talia promised she would only take the awesome painkillers the doctor gave her if she absolutely needed to. Lars and I had looked at each other with disbelief in our eyes, which she pretended to take as an insult. I had left the two to figure out the discharge paperwork when I realized, halfway down the corridor, that I'd forgotten my cell phone in her room. When I got back to the doorway, I stopped cold. Lars and Talia were having a conversation, but not in English. When did Talia learn Swedish? Wait, I was no linguist, but I was sure the language they were speaking was not Swedish. Swedish always made me think of the chef from the Muppets, and this didn't sound like him. I realized it sounded exactly like Ty's date on the night of our last weekly dinner, and she had been from Russia. Talia was speaking Russian, and very easily from the sound of it. There was a lot she still wasn't telling me, obviously. And why on earth would a Swede be fluent in Russian? I shook my head slowly back and forth. No, no more life-changing news today, I thought to myself. I announced my presence with a boisterous and possibly overdone, "I might need my cell phone, you think?" before I bounded into the room, snatched the phone off the counter next to the sink, and left. I didn't know if they realized they'd been busted, and I didn't care. I made a point to care later, after I got some answers out of my dear old dad. Back in my kitchen with Levi, I was still a little concerned about leaving head wound Talia and her beefy Swedish/Russian boy toy, who I hardly knew, with my 3 precious gems overnight. But although I knew they were keeping even more secrets from me, I also knew Talia loved my boys and would never, ever jeopardize their safety. Just remember, she fell and hit her head today. Okay, that was a distortion of the truth, but a necessary one. So she might not be her usual bouncy self. And Lars is coming over too. You remember him? Yeah, I like him. And Rowan loves him. That eased my anxiety a little. Kids usually had good instincts about new people. You'll be second in command, okay? Yes, ma'am, he saluted me. Cute. So why are you going to see Grandpa? It was weird hearing him call my father that. He'd never met him, but I'd told the boys about him. The little I knew myself, anyway. I think it's time I ask him some important questions. Not lying, just not offering too much information that will freak Levi out. Like why he left Oma? I considered that for a moment. 20 years ago, that would have been the first thing out of my mouth, if I'd ever run into him on the street, which I hadn't. But now... No, it doesn't matter why he left. It was so long ago. It's more important that I know why he stayed away from his children. Does that make sense? He simply nodded. He was still standing there wanting to continue our conversation. I realized it had been a while since we'd had time to just talk. And I'll ask him if he might want to meet his 3 handsome grandsons. Really? That idea seemed to please him. Would that be okay if I brought him home to meet you guys? Yeah, that'd be cool. We've never had a grandpa. More Christmas presents. He was grinning at me now, waiting for my reaction. I messed up his hair, which, at 14, he hadn't started caring about just yet. Well, I wouldn't count on that. I might find him living in a cardboard box in an alley somewhere, or I might not be able to find him at all. My tone had inadvertently changed to serious by the end of the sentence, and Levi picked up on it. He was my eternal optimist, though, and attempted to cheer me up. You'll find him, Mom. You're an FBI agent. You can do anything. That worked. I grinned and gave him a quick hug. Now go ask your brothers what they want on their pizza. I'm calling to order it in 2 minutes. At that, he skipped toward the living room where his brothers were playing Rock Band and screamed as if I'd just told him we were going to Disneyland. Woohoo! We're having BJ's Pizza for supper! The other 2 joined him, and it sounded like a college frat party in there. Ty showed up at around 8 p.m., right after Talia and Lars had arrived, Talia looking no worse for the wear. I didn't ask how many times in her life she'd gotten a blunt object to the skull, but I imagined this hadn't been the first time. At that point, she could have told me she was an alien from Venus, where they all have titanium skulls, and I would have believed her. Rowan and Blaze had selected a board game to play with Lars, and had set it all up on the dining room table 2 hours before. Rowan met him at the door and immediately took his hand, pulling him toward the dining room. Lars had expressed a genuine excitement about it, skipping off with my 3-year-old to select his piece for Star Wars Monopoly. Swedish Zumba instructor, Russian spy, Venusian spy, I didn't care. This guy was a prize. Talia was planted firmly on the couch, remote in hand, flipping between What Not to Wear and a marathon of Firefly on the Sci-Fi Channel, when Ty knocked softly on my back kitchen door. I was alone in the room, unloading the dishwasher, when I looked up and saw his face. I wasn't prepared for how elated I would be at the sight of him. It had only been 6 hours since I'd seen him last, but the time had dragged, like waiting for a nearly empty bottle of ketchup to expel some tomatoey goodness onto my cheeseburger. In between dealing with waves of overwhelming emotion at all the information my brain had been forced to absorb that day, and handling menial but necessary tasks, like laundry, dishes, and spending 20 minutes locating a matching pajama top and bottom for Rowan, all I had thought about was how Ty smelled, how he tasted, how he felt, his arms around me, his hands caressing every part of me. I felt a shudder flow through me before I closed the dishwasher. I opened the back door, which I'd locked earlier just for peace of mind, and gave him a shy smile. He looked a little tired, but good. So good. He smiled, and that dimple peeked out at me, his eyes sparkling like I'd never seen before. Ready? He asked. I nodded. I quick said my goodbyes to the boys and Lars and Talia, thanking them profusely and silently praying that they weren't enemy spies sent to kill me and my entire family. Then Ty and I went out the door. He had parked in Talia's driveway to keep the neighbors from talking, and as we walked around Talia's house, we hit a spot that was concealed from the road and any prying eyes. He stopped walking and I slowed, then stopped, raising my eyebrows at him. He reached for my hand. As his fingers intertwined with mine, my heart raced, and my stomach felt like it was hosting the Olympics in there. We looked at each other for a moment. Then we were in each other's arms, and he was kissing me over and over, like he was going to war the next morning or something. And I melted into him. As much as I needed to find my deadbeat dad and get some answers, a meteorite heading straight for us wouldn't have prompted us to stop what we were doing. We had waited too long, been apart too long. I pulled away and gestured for him to wait a minute. I retrieved Talia's secret key, hanging on a nail just above the ground behind a dense bush, and we went inside. I guided him down the hallway and then pushed him onto the bed in the guest room, climbing on top of him. For the next 30 minutes, he reminded me again just how well he remembered every curve, every contour of my body, even after 20 years.
You're listening to Big World Network.